Hello, this is Patricia Kovacevic, General Counsel and Chief Compliance Officer at Nicopure Labs. Welcome to another webinar in our regulatory series. Today we have the privilege of interviewing Mr. Clive Bates, one of the most famous tobacco harm reduction activists in the world. And he will share with us some impressions from his recent visit here in Washington, D.C. Mr. Bates, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and your career, please?
Okay, thank you, Patricia. It's a great pleasure to be here. So yeah, I've got a funny background. I worked in the private sector when I left university for IBM. I've been an activist at Greenpeace. I ran Action on Smoking and Health, which is the main tobacco control organisation in the UK between 1997 and 2000. Then I transferred into government. So I worked in Tony Blair's strategy unit. I worked in UN in Sudan. I ran a big department in the Welsh government. And now I've gone independent. So I do consulting. And also I'm pursuing unfinished business from my time at ASH, which is to get tobacco harm reduction understood. And it's a very exciting time for that, because we've got all the e-cigarette products, heat not burn, and everything's all going crazy.
If I may add, your blog, The Counterfactual, is probably the best source of information on tobacco harm reduction, regulatory, and also very influential in terms of opinion leading in the entire world. I would strongly encourage the audience to really check that out.
Okay.
Certainly is a source of information for us. And you're no shrinking violet in terms of criticizing opinions that you disagree with.
Yes.
Of course, being from the UK, you have a very different perspective there in the UK on tobacco harm reduction as it relates to the role of vaping products, in particular vis-a-vis the conventional cigarette products. And recently you visited with Director Mitch Zeller, the director of the Center for Tobacco Products at the Food and Drug Administration. Can you tell us a little bit what issues you raised before him?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, it was very good of Director Zeller to meet with me. I thought it was quite open-minded on his part, and I was pleased about that. And I think it's, commendable that he did that. Knowing that actually I oppose almost everything that they're doing at the FDA, including up to and including very visibly supporting the Nicopure case against the FDA. And nevertheless, he was still willing to meet, which is good. I basically made the case, which I've been making to everybody I've met in Washington, D.C., that actually the US has a success story on its hands with vaping, that it's an opportunity, yet it's being treated as if it's a threat. Okay, and the basic tenets of that are that adult smoking prevalence is down to the lowest ever level and declining at the fastest rate. Youth smoking prevalence is down and declining at the fastest ever rate. And these things have coincided with the rise of vaping. We have 8.5 million vapers in the United States. 2.5 million of those are ex-smokers. We've got people who seem to be very satisfied with the products. They feel as though it's doing them a power of good. They feel better. They feel very positive about vaping. Essentially, what's not to like? And yet, we have the FDA coming in with a huge regulatory intervention, the benefits of which are very hard to work out what they actually are, yet the costs could be enormous. Those 10 million, 8.5 million vapers now, maybe 10 million in a couple of years. What are they going to do when this regulation comes in? Are they going to use inferior products that meet the regulations, but
such as cigar likes?
Yeah, exactly. The products that are good for the regulators aren't the products that are good for the vapers. Paradoxically, they're looking at it in a different way. Do they then go, well, actually, I like these products, so I'm now going to go to the black market, or I'm going to buy from the internet in China. I'm going to try and get these things in, sort of illegally, which is a bad thing. Quality control issues. Illegal, illegal transactions. Do we suddenly stimulate a black market? Or do I just go, hell, if they're going to make it that different, I'm going to go back to smoking. I can find the cigarettes everywhere. I can't find the vaping products I want anywhere. What's the government telling me to do? So we went through that. And I basically made the case that there's a better way of doing this, which is the system that they've got at the moment. What it will do is it will take every product off the market by default, and then it will allow some of them back on if they can go through this incredibly burdensome, incredibly difficult, narrow channel that has no clear exit, So we will see a 90+% shrinkage in the marketplace. It's a ludicrous thing to do.
And besides, when somebody is taken off the market, I mean, how many companies will be in business without really having a product to sell?
Exactly. So it's not just whether technically it can be done, it's whether it can commercially be done. So if you're a mid-sized company, somebody presents you with a massively difficult regulatory challenge with a very unclear outcome at the end of it, and that's a really important point that I stressed, is that in the EU, it's a mess, but at least it's a clear mess. You know that if you comply with the various parts of the EU directive, your product can be put on the market.
You have a checklist.
You have a checklist.
Exactly.
You work through the checklist. It's mostly tiresome, worthless things that you're required to do, but nevertheless, if you do them, you have access to market. This is something that I don't think people understand about the FDA regulation. Not only is it very burdensome, but it's also incredibly generalized about what the criteria for success are. So you don't know how they will judge your case. They have to approve it. They don't know how you will judge your case, what kind of evidence you need that will convince them, how they will manage trade-offs between different things. So the route through the regulatory system is incredibly opaque. And that's at least as damaging as the fact that it's extremely burdensome as well, that you don't know whether you're going to be successful when you go into it. And I think that's an important part of the case, actually, Patricia, that this isn't really good regulation.
More importantly, we are fearing as an industry that FDA itself doesn't really know what they're looking for, and they will recognize it when they see it, but we're not sure that they have criteria that they have developed themselves for the training of their own internal staff.
I think that's right, and I think the way they're going about it is completely insane. So, the way you look at it, if you're not going to completely flatten the industry to 99% exit, then you have so many pre-market tobacco applications to deal with. You simply can't deal with them as a bureaucracy.
Correct.
So in a sense, you're confined by how many of these applications this bureaucracy can actually cope with. And given it's hardly done any so far, and it's got a massive backlog of substantial equivalence applications for cigarettes, it's not showing that it's got capacity to process these things at anything like the rate that's required.
Correct.
So almost by definition, they have to wipe out most of the industry in order to be able to do the bureaucracy on what's left, which is just like a bizarre thing for a regulator to try to do. So what I wanted to test with Director Zello was a different way of doing this, which is instead of taking everything off and then letting a few products basically made by big tobacco companies come back on through this incredibly difficult process, what you do is you allow everything to stay on. In other words, you change the predicate date and you don't take everything off the market. Right. But then you do two other things. You say, right, we will introduce a set of product standards, so we will use the standard setting powers that the FDA has, and anything that doesn't comply with those standards, that's what comes off the market, okay? And then for new products that come, the third stage of this is that for new products coming out after this year, you would then need to either use the substantial equivalence route or the pre-market tobacco authorization route, which is something that they can already do. So FDA can do two of those things. It can set standards and it can have an authorization procedure for new innovations. Congress needs to do the first thing.
Congress needs to change the grandfather date.
That's right.
Because
so
FDA has said they cannot do it, and in fact, that's what they're arguing in litigation. More importantly, there were lots of submissions to the docket for the proposed deeming rule that suggested precisely what you're saying, and FDA chose to ignore them.
Yeah, and I think, I'm no lawyer, but it's pretty clear in the Act that there is a particular date in February 2007, and that is there in the Act. And
Correct.
the FDA doesn't have any powers to change the Act.
They do have a power to exercise what's called enforcement discretion, and they do utilize that power. I see where it might be a unpopular option with this particular type of product that everybody is a little bit aware of. But let me ask you another question about Director Zeller. You know, he keeps mentioning, and his personal belief as expressed publicly is that certainly vaping products are better for the individual than smoking. He has said that many times. He also has said that nicotine in itself doesn't raise the concerns that smoking conventional cigarettes raises and so on. However, then he refers to the thousands and hundreds of thousands of vapors with success stories of quitting and so on as anecdotes, and somehow doesn't make the leap between the benefit to individual and benefit to public health. In terms of a political approach, what do you think it's needed to make that leap? Because after all, you know, it's very difficult to argue that a product cannot work miracle for public health if it does for the individual.
Yeah. I mean, I think he's an interesting perspective on these issues. He does understand and has articulated quite well what, you know, is often referred to the continuum of risk. That we have combustible products at one end and non-combustible sort of spread out at the other end. It isn't really a continuum, of course. It's a great big cliff edge in between combustible and non-combustible. But leave that aside, and therefore that there is the opportunity to get a health dividend if people switch from the high risk to the low risk products. He understands that completely. The thing that he's always saying is that we need a sort of debate about nicotine in society. We need to understand, you know, where nicotine fits. Is it a sort of form of really like a sort of different form of caffeine that we happen to take in a different way? We used to take it in a way that was very harmful, and actually, if we took coffee by grinding up beans and smoking them, that would be harmful too.
Right. Probably also not very pleasant.
Wouldn't be very nice either, but that's another story. You know, where does this fit in society? And is the issue nicotine, or is the issue disease and premature death? You know, and getting clarity on what we're actually trying to do. And I think he's clear. I think what he would like to see is more debate in the public health community, the business community, the consumer community about what it is that we're actually trying to achieve. But to get back to your specific point, I don't think anybody should ever dismiss anecdotes. We didn't discuss this, but we should never discuss anecdotes. Anecdotes often provide a depth of insight and a sort of almost a visceral account of someone's experience that can convince you and is convincing because it has a texture and a richness to it that simply isn't there in a randomized controlled trial. They contain much more information, these accounts, because they contain qualitative information about people's history. So somebody says, I've smoked for 40 years, I've tried everything, I've tried NRT, I've tried Chantix, I've tried Zyban, I've tried hypnotherapy, I've tried, sewing my mouth up. They've tried everything. And then they say, the thing is, then I went to a vape shop. Oh my goodness, it just totally worked for me. There's really important information in that, and it is an anecdote, but it's a piece of empirical data that tells you something about what's going on. And if you've got one of those, that's very interesting, because the idea that these can't help people stop smoking is confronted by that reality. And then if you have 10,000 anecdotes like that, that starts to build up a picture. And it's part, to me, the qualitative stuff, the accounts from people, is part of the picture. It's very, very interesting. Now, it doesn't tell you that it works for everybody. It doesn't give you a quantitative effect, but it's giving you a sense of very positive experiences that people are going through. And I always recommend the sort of, the public health fanatics who hate vaping, they should read some of these read some of these accounts from people and try to remember what it is they come to work for and get paid for, because those accounts are very powerful. The other thing about those anecdotes is they may not work for Mitch Zeller. Actually, they probably do, but maybe he was being awkward. But they do work in politics. And the way we got a change in the European Union directive was not because of loads of people arguing about randomized controlled trials and toxicology data. It was because people wrote to their representatives with very strong personal accounts of what happened to them, their positive experience, and a deeply expressed and very sincere fear that what these legislators were going to do was to take that away from them. And that's basically what's needed in the United States. People have to tell their stories to their representatives and say, for goodness sake, you're taking everything off the market by 8th of August 2018, more or less. And I'm feeling very vulnerable. This has helped me stop smoking. Where's your assurance this isn't going to make a mess of everything for me?
Correct. And I know to that end that you also conducted some meetings with politicians here on the Hill in Washington, D.C. What was your impression? What's their level of understanding of really the true role of vaping in tobacco harm reduction in the U.S.?
Well, a good thing about these meetings, I met people from both sides and staffers, not senior people, not the congressman or anything. Is there's a lot of interest in it. People have understood that it's an important issue, that it affects a large number of Americans. As I say, 8.5 million vapers, maybe going way beyond that as the technology improves over the coming years. Still got a lot of innovation to come. That these people are very, very satisfied and having a good experience, and that suddenly taking that away from them, arbitrarily as they will see it, actually is a bit of a political time bomb. Okay. On the other hand, many of them, I think, have a stylized account of what vaping is. And if I could put it crudely, it's a predatory corporation using aggressive marketing and childlike flavors to hook kids on vaping, to get kids onto vaping, to hook them on nicotine, and then to get them to smoke and get them to be part of the tobacco industry cash flow forever.
Well, it cannot be farther from the truth, because we all know how this industry started. We all know that the tobacco companies only really came to the table much later. And we also know companies such as ourselves, the marketing expenditure is not really that big. The product sells because of word of mouth. The product sells because it's a quality product and because it fulfills a need. And certainly nobody in their right mind would market to children.
Exactly. But this is a political firefight, and the anti-vaping, abstinence-only, side of this, which is a very large lobby of very well-connected organisations, is using essentially that stylized narrative to try to get the FDA to continue along this sort of suicidal path that it's taken, homicidal path that it's taking, that's the argument, and that's the narrative that's been sold on the Hill, particularly on the Democrat side. So I obviously think, like you, that is complete nonsense. It's nothing like what the companies do. It's nothing like the effect that flavors have. It doesn't reflect the marketing that's done. The marketing is all very positive, anti-smoking marketing in effect. It's basically persuading people to do something other than smoke. The flavors are part of that. They're very important for adults. And to the extent that vaping is disrupting smoking amongst teenagers, the whole thing is valuable even to teenagers. Now, that's a difficult argument to sell in politics, but it's the actual reality. So what I was trying to do was, in the people I was meeting, I was trying to kind of unpack that crude proposition from the other side that it's all predatory, and say, look, this is what's really going on. And look, if you look carefully enough, it's in your numbers. It's in the numbers in the United States. You're just not hearing that interpretation from the people you should hear it from.
Basically, it's smoking going down. You do believe, as we do, that it does have a link to the widespread prevalence of vaping.
Yeah, I mean, you because of the nature of these studies, it's cross-sectional snapshots. You can't follow. There's no cohort that's being followed, and looking at what actually the transitions that they make. But what you can say, it's consistent with the data is consistent with the hypothesis that vaping is driving out smoking and displacing it. And then you can say, well, then you can argue, There isn't really any other obvious explanation for why that is. And then you can also argue it's completely reasonable that it would. What you've got is a product here that gives people who smoke all the things that they want from smoking. So, nicotine, throat hit, taste, flavor, hand-to-mouth activity, rituals that they can perform at certain types of day, socializing mechanisms, and so on. Those are many of the features that smokers value in smoking. It replaces many of those reasonably well. It adds some things like personalization, which are important things for vapors. And yet it takes away the things that people don't like about smoking. So that's, cancer, heart disease, respiratory illness, being, essentially perceived as antisocial, the stigma of leaving a kind of smell wherever you go. Those, and the fact it's very expensive and getting more expensive. So anybody looking at that would say, well, vaping has a very attractive proposition to smokers. It's just not surprising that it's winning in the marketplace and that people are switching. And actually, probably if everybody told the truth about vaping, we would see a lot more switching than we've actually seen at the moment.
Is this what's happening in the UK? I know the Public Health England guidance or guidelines suggests smoking counsellors to actually inform smokers who otherwise cannot quit that they might want to give vaping a try.
Well, I think the smoking counsellor side of it is a bit of a distraction, to be honest. A very, very small number of people actually ever go to a smoking counsellor. And those are people who are already pretty motivated to quit and will, basically try quite hard. The interesting thing is what's going out, if you like, in the wild, in the marketplace. Because this is a market-based public health intervention that doesn't involve any public health people and doesn't involve anything in the public sector, which is probably why many of them are uneasy about it. So vapers are choosing in the marketplace to use products that are different to cigarettes, but for many of the same reasons. They like taking nicotine, they like all the things I just said. And that is what's generating the big population change. It's the same in the United States. 8.5 million people haven't been to a smoking cessation counsellor and been given these things as if they are, a treatment to cure an illness.
They've been to a vape shop, though.
They've been to a vape shop, and somebody's persuaded them that this is a cool thing to do. But if you look at the perception data in the US, it's shocking, really. There's a survey done for the National Cancer Institute by the National Cancer Institute for the FDA. It shows that only 5.3% of American adults think that vaping is very much less harmful than smoking. Okay. Now that is the only correct answer that's available. It can't be anything other than very much less harmful. 37% think it's as harmful or more harmful. And another, I think about 35%, just don't know. Okay? So when you've got that situation, and then the rest basically think it's less harmful, but not very much less harmful. But less harmful, what does that mean? It could mean 3% less harmful, 20% less harmful, 50% less harmful. The only rightish answer is at least 95% less harmful.
So do you believe that the government has a duty here in the US to inform citizens about the potential or the comparative risk of these products rather than asking the industry to go through the onerous modified risk tobacco product application in order to demonstrate that? Can they not talk about the category as a whole as opposed to an individual product and say the category certainly helps you reduce the harm from tobacco? We cannot identify a specific product, and very quickly, why do you think they're not doing it?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. The response. What's happened is instead of the state or the medical authorities, CDC, actually giving people realistic information about relative risks that informs them, enables them to make sensible, informed choices about the risks that they're taking on. And that it's applied for many years about smokeless tobacco, also for e-cigarettes. What they're doing is they're actually providing a barrage of misleading information. They're bigging up risks that aren't really material. They're talking up tiny, tiny elements of toxicity as if they're really, really draconian. They're not making the key information available to consumers, which is the huge difference in risk between smoking and vaping. Instead, the official way of doing that is, as you say, and when you think about it, this is truly insane. You say consumers will get reliable information about risk if and only if a tobacco company decides it's in their commercial interest to go through the application process. Okay? Since when did anyone think it was a good idea to rely on tobacco industry, commercial imperatives to determine whether the consumers should get good information about good health relevant information about risks of products? It's a mad idea. That's the responsibility of agencies, public health agencies, to guide people through these choices, not companies.
Thank you very much. I think you're absolutely right, and I really hope that you will continue your travels, not only here in the US, but also around the world, to talk about these issues to governments as well as public agencies. It is in everybody's interest to hear them, partly because, as you said, there is a great deal of misinformation among the public, which then perpetuates, of course, among other government officials. Well, thank you again for your time. We're very honored to have you here. And for you, the audience, we really hope this was extremely informative. We're looking forward to seeing you in our next webinars. Thank you.